The story of Hurricane Iniki begins quietly, far from the lush shores of Kauai. On Sunday, September 5th of 1992, a small cluster of thunderstorms churned over the eastern Pacific Ocean. At first, it was little more than a tropical disturbance, common in those waters, rarely a serious threat to the Hawaiian Islands. Its roots may have stretched thousands of miles across the globe, seeded by an atmospheric wave that had traveled from the African coast weeks before. Slowly, the disturbance organized, and by September 5th, it was classified as a tropical depression. For Hawaiians, this posed no alarm. Hurricanes were something the islands had learned to dismiss. In living memory, most systems had bent away to the north or slipped harmlessly south, deflected by a protective ridge of high pressure known as the subtropical ridge. This invisible shield had spared the islands again and again, leaving residents to believe that direct strikes were unlikely, almost mythical. As the first week of September unfolded, life on Kauai was completely normal. Families were preparing for the start of the high school football season. Skies were brilliantly clear, and the island's gardens and forests flourished under the late summer sun. There was no sense of urgency, no reason to suspect the peace would soon end. By Tuesday, September 8th, the depression had intensified into a tropical storm, earning its name Iniki, a Hawaiian word meaning strong and piercing wind. A day later, it strengthened further, upgraded to a hurricane. Forecasts continued to show the system tracking westward, expected to pass south of the Hawaiian chain without incident. The greatest concern voiced at the time was the potential for a high surf along south-facing shores. But while people went about their daily lives, the atmosphere above them was changing. The subtropical ridge, the very shield that had protected Hawaii for decades, began to weaken. At the same time, a deep trough of low pressure started digging southward across the central Pacific, acting like a giant vacuum in the atmosphere. This subtle but critical shift would set Iniki on a path unlike any storm before it. By Thursday, September 10th, forecasters at the Central Pacific Hurricane Center were grappling with uncertainty. Some computer models still suggested the hurricane would remain on its westward course. Others, however, showed an alarming alternative, a sudden and sharp turn to the north. For now, those projections were treated as outliers, but in just a matter of hours, they would prove to be tragically correct. On the morning of Friday, September 11th of 1992, residents of Kauai woke to radio bulletins that left many stunned. Overnight, Hurricane Iniki had executed the feared northward turn. What had once seemed like a distant storm was now racing directly toward the island. By sunrise, Iniki had reached Category 4 strength, with sustained winds near 140 miles per hour. At 8 o'clock that morning, the Central Pacific Hurricane Center issued a hurricane warning for Kauai. This was the first time in modern Hawaiian history that such an urgent alert had been delivered for the island. Schools closed immediately, businesses shuttered their doors, and families scrambled to buy last-minute supplies. Stores quickly ran out of bottled water, canned goods, and flashlights. For many, it was their first true hurricane preparation experience. By midday, the outer bands of Iniki began sweeping across Kauai. Heavy rain fell in bursts, bending palm trees and obscuring the mountains in sheets of gray. Around 1 in the afternoon, the sky darkened as though it were twilight, even though the sun was high above the Pacific. The storm's eye was rapidly approaching. At 3:30 in the afternoon, the full force of Iniki made landfall on Kauai's south shore near the town of Waimea. Wind gusts were recorded at more than 160 miles per hour, strong enough to rip roofs from homes and snap utility poles like matchsticks. Debris flew through the air as if it were shrapnel. Entire groves of trees were flattened in minutes. The storm surge arrived shortly after, inundating coastal neighborhoods. Walls of seawater up to 6 feet high pushed inland, destroying boats, flooding houses, and sweeping vehicles from roads. Some residents who had ignored evacuation orders found themselves trapped, clinging to trees, or climbing onto rooftops as the waters rose. For more than 2 hours, Kauai was battered relentlessly. As the eye passed over, a brief and eerie calm settled across parts of the island. The winds died, and for a moment, people stepped outside to survey the devastation. But this peace lasted only half an hour before the back half of the storm slammed the island with equal, if not greater, ferocity. By evening, Iniki had passed northward, leaving behind silence, broken only by the sound of dripping rain and distant sirens. Kauai, once lush and vibrant, was now a scene of staggering destruction. What had been a paradise that morning was unrecognizable by nightfall. When daylight returned on Saturday, September 12th of 1992, the full scope of Iniki's devastation became clear. Nearly every structure on Kauai had suffered some form of damage, with entire neighborhoods reduced to piles of splintered wood and twisted metal. Officials later estimated that more than 14,000 homes were damaged, and over 1,400 were completely destroyed. Roofs were peeled away with ease, leaving families exposed to the elements. Electric power was cut off island-wide, plunging residents into darkness for weeks. Fallen transmission lines crisscrossed roads, while utility poles leaned or snapped across highways, blocking travel. Communication was crippled as well. Telephone service collapsed, and emergency radios became the only reliable link between communities. The lack of information left many people uncertain about when aid might arrive. Agriculture, the lifeblood of Kauai, was devastated. The island's famous sugarcane fields were flattened, and fruit orchards were stripped bare in a matter of hours. Entire crops were lost, dealing a severe blow to farmers and the local economy. Iniki also uprooted countless trees, leaving barren hillsides where lush green once thrived. Tourism, another critical industry, ground to a halt. Hotels along the southern coast were left in ruins, with shattered windows, flooded lobbies, and debris littering once pristine beaches. Visitors stranded on the island faced limited food, water, and shelter, relying heavily on the generosity of residents. The image of paradise had been replaced by scenes of ruin. The natural environment also bore deep scars. Coral reefs were smashed by the storm surge, and countless birds lost their nesting grounds. Some endangered species, already struggling for survival, faced even greater challenges after the hurricane reshaped their habitats. Altogether, damages from Hurricane Iniki were calculated at around $3 billion, making it the costliest hurricane in Hawaiian history. Yet beyond the numbers, what stood out most was the sheer scale of human loss, homes, livelihoods, and the sense of safety that had once defined life on Kauai. In the immediate aftermath of Hurricane Iniki, the United States military played a crucial role in relief operations. Within hours, cargo planes began arriving from Oahu, bringing food, water, medical supplies, and emergency crews. The National Guard was deployed to restore order, clear roads, and distribute essentials to families who had lost nearly everything. For many residents, the sight of helicopters dropping aid packages was the first sign of hope since the storm passed. FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, established command centers on Kauai to coordinate disaster response. Thousands of residents registered for assistance, and emergency shelters were set up in schools, churches, and community centers. The American Red Cross mobilized volunteers nationwide, providing meals, blankets, and temporary housing to those displaced. One of the unique challenges after Iniki was restoring communication. With telephone lines destroyed and electricity unavailable, the only reliable way to reach the outside world was through amateur radio operators. These volunteer ham radio users relayed critical information between Kauai and other islands, keeping both officials and families connected during the crisis. The recovery also depended heavily on local communities pulling together. Neighbors shared food and water, while residents organized cleanup crews to clear debris from homes and roads. Schools that had lost roofs and classrooms still tried to resume lessons, often holding classes outdoors under makeshift tents. Celebrities and public figures also drew attention to the disaster. Musicians from Hawaii and across the mainland organized benefit concerts, raising funds for rebuilding efforts. The storm even disrupted Hollywood. Production for the movie Jurassic Park, which was being filmed on Kauai, was forced to shut down temporarily due to the extensive damage. Rebuilding took years. Many families lived in temporary housing long after the storm passed, and full restoration of electricity and infrastructure stretched into months. Insurance companies were overwhelmed with claims, and for some residents, recovery was a slow and frustrating process. Despite the hardships, the resilience of Kauai's people became a defining story of Hurricane Iniki. The island had been brought to its knees, but the strength of its communities and the aid from across the nation kept recovery moving forward. Hurricane Iniki left behind more than broken homes and battered landscapes. It reshaped how Hawaii prepares for natural disasters. The storm exposed weaknesses in communication systems, power grids, and evacuation planning. In the years that followed, the state invested heavily in stronger emergency sirens, improved weather monitoring, and updated building codes designed to withstand hurricane-force winds. For residents of Kauai, the memory of Iniki became a generational touchstone. Families passed down stories of survival and resilience, ensuring that the lessons of 1992 would not be forgotten. Annual hurricane preparedness drills became more common across the islands, with officials urging households to keep at least 2 weeks of supplies on hand in case of another major storm. The economic impact lingered for years. Tourism, a cornerstone of Hawaii's economy, suffered a major setback as resorts and attractions on Kauai struggled to reopen. Some businesses never returned, while others rebuilt stronger and more storm-resistant. Farmers, too, had to start over, replanting crops and repairing damaged irrigation systems. Iniki also carried a sobering reminder of climate vulnerability. While hurricanes in Hawaii are rare, scientists have noted that warming ocean waters could increase the strength of storms reaching the islands. For many, Iniki is still a warning of what future hurricanes might look like in a changing climate. 3 decades later, Hurricane Iniki remains the strongest hurricane ever recorded in Hawaii's history. It tested the island of Kauai in ways no one could have imagined, but it also showed the strength and determination of its people. Today, the legacy of Iniki is not only the destruction it caused, but also the improvements it inspired in preparedness and resilience. Hawaii continues to carry the scars of that September day, but it also carries the knowledge and readiness to face whatever storms may come next. The deadliest tsunami in Hawaii's history did not begin in the tropics, but thousands of miles away in one of the harshest, most remote places on Earth, the Aleutian Islands of Alaska. In the early morning hours of April 1st, 1946, at precisely 2:29 a.m. local time, the seafloor beneath the North Pacific ruptured with astonishing force. This was not an ordinary earthquake. Modern studies estimate it at a magnitude of 8.6, striking less than 10 miles beneath the ocean floor. What made it unusual was its type. It was a so-called tsunami earthquake, meaning the shaking felt on land was not as violently sharp as one might expect from such a large magnitude. Instead, the rupture involved a slow, massive heave of the seafloor, vertically thrusting water upwards in a way that was especially efficient at generating tsunamis. The rupture displaced the seafloor by as much as 40 feet in some places. That sudden movement acted like an enormous paddle slapping the Pacific Ocean, sending out a train of tsunami waves in every direction. Out in the deep ocean, these waves were nearly invisible, stretching over 100 miles from crest to crest and standing only a few feet tall. Ships at sea would have barely noticed them, perhaps only a gentle lift beneath their hulls. But while nearly imperceptible on the surface, the waves were moving at extraordinary speeds, racing outward at up to 500 miles per hour, the velocity of a modern jet aircraft. The first catastrophic proof of this tsunami's power came only minutes after the earthquake. On Unimak Island in Alaska, the 5-story Scotch Cap Lighthouse, a reinforced concrete structure thought to be nearly indestructible, was obliterated. The wave that struck the station was later estimated to be more than 130 feet high. The tower and all 5 men stationed there were swept completely away, leaving nothing but fragments scattered across the coastline. That towering wall of water was only the beginning. The rest of the tsunami continued silently southward, across 2,400 miles of open ocean, carrying with it the energy of the Earth's violent convulsion. In its path lay Hawaii, completely unaware, with no system of warnings, no sirens, and no preparation for what was already on its way. By the time dawn broke on April 1st, 1946, Hawaii was carrying on with ordinary life. Radio stations filled the air with morning broadcasts, fishermen readied their boats, and school children made their way to class. There were no sirens, no bulletins, and no hint of the disaster rushing toward the islands. The journey of the tsunami from Alaska to Hawaii had taken just under 5 hours, but without a warning system, no one knew it was coming. At about 7 a.m., the first waves reached the Big Island's northeastern coast near Hilo. Witnesses later described how the ocean withdrew suddenly, exposing coral reefs and seafloor that were never seen dry. Moments later, the sea came roaring back. The initial surge was estimated to be more than 30 feet high, crashing inland with a force capable of uprooting massive trees and tossing cars like toys. Entire neighborhoods were engulfed in seconds. The devastation was worst in the town of Hilo, which faced the waves head-on. Wooden homes splintered into pieces, businesses were smashed apart, and rail lines were ripped from the ground. Some of the heaviest losses occurred at schools, where the timing of the waves coincided with children just arriving for their morning lessons. Buildings collapsed or were swept away, leaving chaos and fear in their wake. Elsewhere on the Big Island, plantations and small villages suffered immense destruction. In Laupahoehoe, a wave surged deep into the valley, leaving behind shattered homes and scattered belongings. Survivors recalled the terrifying roar of the water, followed by silence, as entire families were lost to the sea. The waves did not stop at the Big Island. As the tsunami radiated outward, other islands were struck in succession. Maui, Oahu, and Kauai each endured surges that devastated low-lying coastal areas. Harbors were destroyed, boats were sunk or flung ashore, and bridges were washed away. Across the island chain, the tsunami left behind a trail of wreckage that stunned Hawaiians, who had never before experienced such a catastrophe. The people of Hawaii were left bewildered. No storm clouds had been seen, no winds had howled, and yet the sea had risen out of nowhere to destroy entire communities. What they could not yet know was that the waves they had just endured were part of one of the most destructive natural disasters ever recorded in the island's history. When the waves finally receded, the true scale of the tragedy began to emerge. Across Hawaii, the tsunami claimed the lives of more than 150 people, with the greatest number of deaths occurring on the Big Island. Hilo alone saw dozens of families torn apart and small coastal villages lost entire generations. The community of Laupahoehoe was especially devastated, where 24 people, including schoolchildren and teachers, were killed when the waves swept through the school grounds. Many survivors described the experience as both sudden and surreal. Some were carried hundreds of feet inland by the water, clinging to the floating debris in desperate attempts to stay alive. Others managed to scramble to higher ground only to watch helplessly as their homes, workplaces, and loved ones disappeared beneath the churning sea. The stories of survival would later become part of the island's collective memory, passed down as solemn reminders of nature's power. The physical destruction was immense. Nearly every waterfront business in Hilo was destroyed, leaving the town's economy crippled. Sugar plantations, which were a backbone of Hawaii's economy at the time, lost large portions of their infrastructure as fields were drowned in salt water and equipment was washed away. Roads and bridges were destroyed, leaving some communities isolated for days before help could arrive. Relief efforts began almost immediately. The Red Cross, local churches, and volunteers worked to provide shelter and food for those left homeless. Military personnel stationed in Hawaii also assisted in search and rescue operations, using their equipment to clear debris and reopen access to coastal towns. Despite these efforts, many survivors faced weeks of hardship, living in makeshift shelters while struggling to rebuild their lives from the ruins. The psychological toll was equally severe. Families mourned lost loved ones, and children who survived the disaster carried lifelong trauma. Entire communities struggled with the haunting memory of a wave that had struck without warning. The suddenness of the event left many fearful of the ocean, a place that had always been central to Hawaiian life and culture. For Hawaii, the 1946 tsunami was not just a natural disaster, it was a turning point. It revealed how vulnerable the islands were to events that originated far across the Pacific, and it set the stage for major changes in how tsunamis would be studied and prepared for in the future. The devastation of the 1946 tsunami forced governments and scientists to confront a troubling reality. The Pacific Ocean had no coordinated system to detect or warn against tsunamis. Until then, waves were only understood after they arrived, leaving coastal communities defenseless. The disaster highlighted an urgent need for international cooperation, and Hawaii became the center of this effort. In 1949, just 3 years after the tragedy, the United States established the Seismic Sea Wave Warning System in Honolulu. This was the very first attempt at a structured tsunami warning network. Its mission was simple but ambitious: to detect earthquakes across the Pacific and issue alerts if those quakes were strong enough to generate dangerous waves. The system relied on seismic monitoring stations scattered throughout the region, along with tide gauges that recorded changes in sea level. Messages were relayed by telegraph and telephone, technology that seems primitive by today's standards, but was groundbreaking at the time. If an undersea earthquake occurred, data would be analyzed in Honolulu, and warnings could then be broadcast to at-risk communities in Hawaii and beyond. This marked the beginning of what would eventually evolve into the Pacific Tsunami Warning Center. Over the years, the system grew to include dozens of member nations, stretching across Asia, the Americas, and Oceania. By Sharing data internationally, scientists could track tsunamis more accurately and warn coastal populations hours before waves made landfall. The creation of this system was not just a scientific achievement, but a response to human suffering. Policymakers and scientists alike understood that the lives lost in 1946 could not be brought back, but future disasters could be mitigated. The warning system gave coastal communities a fighting chance, turning an unexpected tragedy into a catalyst for progress. For Hawaii, this new level of preparedness became part of daily life. Residents began taking sirens, drills, and evacuation routes seriously, knowing all too well that tsunamis were not just distant possibilities, but real threats that could strike at any time. In the decades following the 1946 tsunami science underwent a remarkable transformation. Early warning systems that once relied only on seismographs and tide gauges began to incorporate advanced technologies that could detect and track waves across the entire Pacific Ocean. By the 1960s, computers allowed scientists to model wave behavior, helping them predict how tsunamis might travel after an undersea earthquake. A turning point came in the 1990s with the development of the Deep Ocean Assessment and a reporting of tsunamis system, better known as DART buoys. These specialized instruments anchored to the seafloor and connected to surface buoys could measure minute changes in water pressure as a tsunami passed by. The information was transmitted in real time by satellite, giving scientists precise data on wave height, speed, and direction. Satellites also played a vital role in expanding global awareness of tsunamis. They provided rapid communication channels and enabled detailed observation of the ocean's surface. Combined with seismographic networks, these tools allowed scientists not only to detect tsunamis more quickly, but also to issue warnings to nations far beyond the Pacific. Hawaii's role in this global effort remained central. The Pacific Tsunami Warning Center in Honolulu continued to expand, offering alerts not only to the islands, but also to dozens of countries across the Pacific Rim. Today, its warnings are distributed within minutes of a major undersea earthquake, a speed unthinkable in the 1940s. What makes these technological advancements even more significant is their life-saving potential. While natural disasters cannot be stopped, accurate detection and rapid communication can drastically reduce casualties. Communities now receive evacuation alerts through sirens, radios, and even smartphone notifications, tools that did not exist when the deadly waves of 1946 struck without warning. The evolution of tsunami science shows how far humanity has come since that fateful April morning. It reflects a blend of scientific innovation, international cooperation, and lessons learned the hard way. Each improvement, from seafloor sensors to satellite imaging, stands as a direct response to the tragedy that devastated Hawaii in 1946. The 1946 tsunami left scars on Hawaii that were both physical and cultural. Entire shorelines were reshaped, and many coastal communities had to rebuild from nothing. Yet, beyond the destruction, the event became a defining moment in the island's collective memory. Stories of survival, loss, and resilience were passed down through families, ensuring that the lessons of that day would never be forgotten. Schools across Hawaii eventually began incorporating tsunami education into their programs, teaching children evacuation routes and the importance of seeking higher ground. Sirens were installed along beaches and towns, becoming a familiar part of life on the islands. For residents, the sound of those sirens served not only as a warning system, but also as a reminder of the tragedy that claimed lives decades earlier. Memorials were created to honor those who were lost, particularly in the hardest hit areas of Hilo and Laupahoehoe. These quiet places of remembrance connect today's communities to the experiences of those who endured the waves in April of 1946. Each ceremony held there reinforces the importance of vigilance in the face of natural disasters. Globally, the disaster influenced how nations prepared for tsunamis. It highlighted the need for cooperation between countries sharing the Pacific Ocean, eventually leading to international warning networks that now safeguard millions of people. The memory of what happened in Hawaii played a major role in shaping that system. Today, the 1946 tsunami is remembered not only as one of the deadliest natural disasters in Hawaii's history, but also as the catalyst for life-saving advancements. The lessons learned from that day continue to guide preparedness efforts around the world, reminding us that while the ocean brings life and beauty, it also carries unimaginable power. The story of the 1946 tsunami ultimately stands as both a warning and a testament to resilience. It reminds us that vigilance, preparation, and respect for nature are the best defenses against forces far beyond human control. In the early 1980s, Hawaii stood as the ultimate image of tranquility. The island sat isolated in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, more than 2,000 miles from the nearest continent. Tourists flocked to Oahu, Maui, Kauai, and the Big Island to escape the chaos of the mainland, while residents lived to the rhythm of the trade winds, the surf, and a climate that seemed to promise eternal calm. For many people, the idea of a major hurricane striking the islands simply did not fit into their worldview. This sense of invulnerability was not just cultural, it was also rooted in history. Hawaii had not experienced a direct destructive hurricane since the early 20th century. Smaller tropical storms had brushed the islands from time to time, but nothing in living memory compared to the catastrophic cyclones that battered places like the Gulf Coast or the Caribbean. Meteorologists even noted that the region's relatively cooler waters and the stabilizing influence of surrounding weather patterns tended to weaken storms before they reached Hawaii. Over time, this gave rise to a powerful myth that the islands were naturally protected, shielded by the Pacific itself. This belief shaped nearly every aspect of life. Coastal communities expanded without serious consideration of storm surge risks. Hotels and resorts, particularly on Kauai and Oahu, were designed to highlight oceanfront beauty rather than to withstand hurricane-force winds. Families rarely kept emergency supplies beyond what was needed for short-term power outages, and even the state's disaster plans were limited, built more for tsunamis than for cyclones. But beneath the calm, Hawaii's greatest vulnerability was growing: complacency. A generation had passed without a hurricane-level disaster, and with each quiet season, the collective memory of danger faded further into the past. It was a blind spot that would prove catastrophic. In November of 1982, a storm was brewing thousands of miles away that would soon shatter the illusion of safety and remind the islands, in the harshest possible way, that paradise is never immune to nature's fury. Hurricane Iwa began not near Hawaii, but thousands of miles away in the warm waters of the Central Pacific during late November of 1982. The storm first appeared as a low-pressure disturbance several hundred miles southwest of the islands. At the time, meteorologists were already dealing with unusual conditions tied to one of the strongest El Niño events of the 20th century. This weather pattern was shifting currents and altering the atmosphere across the Pacific, creating an environment that allowed tropical cyclones to strengthen more easily than normal in this part of the ocean. By November 19th, the disturbance had grown into a tropical depression. Satellite technology, still relatively new in the early 1980s, gave forecasters their first clear look at the system's organization. As the depression gathered strength, it evolved into a tropical storm and was given the name Iwa. For a time, it appeared the storm might veer away, but shifts in the jet stream began steering it toward the Hawaiian chain. Over the next 2 days, Iwa intensified. Warm ocean waters fueled its growth, while favorable winds allowed it to maintain a strong circulation. By November 23rd, the storm had reached hurricane status, with sustained winds climbing past 100 miles per hour. Although this made Iwa only a Category 1 hurricane, its large size and projected track through the islands made it especially dangerous. Warnings began to filter through the islands, but the timing worked against the public. Many residents were preoccupied with preparations for Thanksgiving, and with decades having passed since Hawaii's last major hurricane, few took the storm seriously at first. Government officials and weather experts urged people to secure property and prepare for possible flooding, but a sense of disbelief lingered across the islands. Unseen from the shorelines of Kauai and Oahu, Hurricane Iwa was steadily advancing, its spiral bands stretching wide across the ocean, carrying with them the winds and waves that would soon mark the most destructive storm Hawaii had experienced in over 60 years. On the afternoon of November 23, 1982, Hurricane Iwa swept dangerously close to the Hawaiian Islands. The storm did not make direct landfall but passed just northwest of Kauai, close enough that the island bore the brunt of its powerful winds and surging seas. By this point, Iwa's sustained winds were over 100 miles per hour, with even stronger gusts ripping through coastal and inland areas. As the outer bands reached Oahu and Kauai, power lines toppled and entire communities were plunged into darkness. Coconut trees and massive banyan trees, normally symbols of resilience, were snapped in half or uprooted completely. Homes built with lighter materials stood little chance against the pounding winds. Roofs were torn away, walls collapsed, and windows shattered as debris turned into dangerous projectiles. The storm surge was equally devastating. Along the coastlines of Kauai, seawater rushed inland, swamping neighborhoods, destroying piers, and sweeping away boats. The island of Niihau also faced heavy impacts, though fewer details emerged because of its limited population and restricted access. On Oahu, waves as high as 25 feet struck Waikiki and other shoreline communities, leaving behind wreckage that stunned both residents and tourists. Communication was another casualty of Iwa. Telephone lines went down, making it nearly impossible for families to reach loved ones or for officials to get accurate information from the hardest hit areas. Radio broadcasts became the primary source of updates, with announcers urging people to stay indoors and away from floodwaters. As evening fell, the storm continued its assault. The timing made recovery efforts nearly impossible, and people were forced to endure the hurricane's fury through the night. For many, the sound of howling winds, crashing waves, and collapsing structures was unlike anything they had ever experienced. When the winds finally began to ease, entire towns on Kauai and Oahu were left in ruins, and it was clear that Hawaii had faced one of the most destructive hurricanes in its modern history. When daylight returned on November 24, 1982, the scope of Hurricane Iwa's destruction became visible. On Kauai, nearly every community reported severe damage. Roads were blocked by fallen trees, power poles, and piles of wreckage. Utility crews struggled to even begin assessments as the damage stretched for miles across the island. The electricity grid was shattered. At least half of Kauai's residents were without power, some for weeks, and water systems were also disrupted. Schools and public buildings were closed indefinitely, many having lost roofs or suffered structural damage. Farmers on the island faced staggering losses as entire fields of taro, sugarcane, and vegetables were flattened or flooded. Oahu also revealed widespread destruction. The state's capital, Honolulu, was spared from the storm's full force, but still suffered heavy losses, especially along the coastline. Dozens of boats in Honolulu harbor were sunk or severely damaged, leaving the state's fishing and shipping industries reeling. Waikiki's beachfront hotels and businesses were covered in sand and debris, forcing closures during what was normally a busy holiday season. Air travel was brought to a halt. Honolulu International Airport reported damage to facilities, and with power outages across the islands, communications and scheduling collapsed. Relief flights were grounded at first, and stranded travelers were left uncertain about when they would be able to leave or receive aid. The economic toll was immediately clear. Initial estimates placed the destruction at over $200 million, making Iwa the most expensive hurricane in Hawaii's recorded history at that time. Insurance companies faced a flood of claims, while families without coverage were left to rely on limited savings and federal disaster assistance. Yet, amid the devastation, the community response was swift. Neighbors worked together to clear roads and share food. Churches and schools opened as makeshift shelters, housing families who had lost everything. Local radio stations became lifelines, broadcasting locations for aid, food, and medical services. As federal and state officials began arriving on the islands, it was clear that Hawaii was facing a disaster unlike any it had seen in decades. The storm had not only battered homes and businesses, it had also tested the resilience of the islands themselves. In the days following Hurricane Iwa, federal assistance quickly became essential. On November 27, 1982, President Ronald Reagan declared Kauai and Oahu federal disaster areas, unlocking millions of dollars in aid. The Federal Emergency Management Agency, which was still relatively new at the time, coordinated with Hawaii's state government to provide emergency housing, food, and rebuilding assistance. On Kauai, the hardest hit island, hundreds of families were left without homes. Temporary shelters filled with evacuees who had lost nearly everything in the storm. Mobile housing units were brought in, but it took weeks before most displaced families had stable living arrangements. Businesses also struggled to recover, as many small shops and farms lacked the resources to rebuild quickly without federal loans. Relief workers described the island as a landscape of blue tarps, as damaged roofs were hastily patched to keep out the rain. Churches, schools, and community groups became central hubs for distributing food and supplies, with volunteers working alongside National Guard units to organize relief. The economic consequences stretched far beyond the immediate destruction. Hawaii's tourism industry, which depended heavily on winter visitors, was devastated by the storm's timing. Many hotels had to close for repairs, leading to widespread layoffs. Agricultural losses were equally severe, as entire harvests of sugarcane and other crops were lost, forcing some farms out of business entirely. Oahu faced its own challenges. Honolulu's busy harbor, one of the state's most vital economic lifelines, needed significant repairs after dozens of vessels were sunk or wrecked. Restoring shipping and fishing operations was critical, as the islands depended heavily on imported goods. The financial cost continued to climb, eventually surpassing $250 million. For Hawaii, which had not experienced a hurricane of this magnitude in modern history, the recovery revealed just how vulnerable the islands were to extreme weather. Despite the hardship, the resilience of Hawaii's communities stood out. Stories emerged of neighbors sharing food and supplies, of volunteers helping rebuild homes, and of people coming together to support those who had lost the most. For many residents, the recovery was not just about restoring property, it was about restoring a sense of normalcy and strength, after the islands had been tested by one of the most destructive storms in their history. Hurricane Iwa left behind more than physical damage. It reshaped how Hawaii prepared for future storms. Before 1982, many residents believed the islands were relatively safe from major hurricanes since decades had passed without a direct strike. Iwa shattered that sense of security. In the years that followed, Hawaii invested in stronger disaster preparedness systems. Emergency broadcast alerts were updated, evacuation procedures were re-examined, and building codes were strengthened to better withstand high winds and storm surge. The hurricane also prompted new research into Pacific weather patterns, particularly the influence of El Nino, which had played a role in steering Iwa toward the islands. The storm's financial toll, which reached more than $250 million, remained one of the highest disaster costs in Hawaii's history up to that time. For many, it became clear that the state's economy, heavily dependent on tourism, agriculture, and shipping, could be severely disrupted by just one powerful storm. Insurance companies adjusted policies, and government agencies began pushing for stronger infrastructure to protect the island's most critical industries. Culturally, Iwa became a shared memory for those who lived through it. Residents recalled the eerie silence before the winds, the long hours without power, and the community efforts that helped them recover. It became a reminder of Hawaii's vulnerability in the vast Pacific, where storms could appear with little warning and leave devastation in their path. Hurricane Iwa also served as a warning for future generations. When Hurricane Iniki struck Kauai a decade later in 1992, many emergency managers credited the lessons learned from Iwa for saving lives. Iwa had shown the importance of preparation, communication, and resilience in the face of nature's power. Today, the story of Hurricane Iwa is remembered not only for the destruction it caused, but also for the lessons it taught. It was a turning point that reshaped Hawaii's relationship with natural disasters, proving that even paradise is not safe from the fury of the sea and sky.